Hi everyone, it's Ardith, and today I'm excited to be part of showing you 10 ideas for holiday cards. I've got 5 cards here on my channel, and Ingrid has 5 more on hers. I've linked her video in the description below. I've chosen products from lots of my favorite companies, some stamps and dies, stencils and inks, but these ideas will work with similar items you already have. So let's dive right in. My first card starts with a panel of Desert Storm cardstock, some Hero Arts Unicorn White Pigment ink, a sponge dauber, and the pretty pink Posh Leaves and Berries stencil. Sometimes it's a challenge to get really vibrant colors on craft cardstock, and an easy way to achieve that is to put a layer of white ink down first. I use pixie spray on the back of the stencil so that all the bits will stick down while I'm blending ink over it. I started with a sponge dauber, but as I went on, I wondered if one of the new scrapbook.com dome blenders would be faster. The goal here is really just to try and get a quick but even layer of white ink onto the cardstock to be the base for the colors in the next step. When I had the stencil completely covered, I placed the panel into a shoebox lid that I've lined with aluminum foil, and I turned on my heat gun to heat up so that I could dry the pigment ink. This lid helps save my fingers from the risk of burning, and I think that the heat reflects back from the foil and helps to reduce warping. You can leave the white ink to dry on its own, but it does take quite a bit of time to dry completely. I cleaned all the white ink off the stencil before I laid it back down on the panel, taking care to get it pretty much in the same place. I'm using Catherine Pooler inks to add color to this, but I'm lazy and I don't want to do any masking. This means I need blending tools that are even smaller than my sponge daubers, and I have these Ranger detail blenders. They're very small and pretty much the perfect size for the berries. I use Sangria, which is one of the newest colors of Catherine Pooler ink. It's a lovely rich reddish purple, and it pops quite a bit. When I finished the berries, I used 2 shades of green for the leaves. I started with Lemongrass, which is really almost a yellow, and another detail blender stick, and I went into all of the leaf tips. I used a mix of pouncing and blending motions, and obviously I have to be a little careful of the Sangria ink that's already on the stencil. When the lemongrass was finished, I went back in with green tea, which is a deeper green. I used it around the bases of each leaf, trying to get a good blend. I can feel that the white ink is still a little damp, and it's actually quite helpful. It makes the ink feel a bit creamy and makes the blending really easy. I went back in with the lemongrass to smooth out a few of the blends in a couple of places, and then I carefully removed the stencil. I love the dimension that the blended inks have given to the leaves. That stencil is still full of messy, inky goodness, and it's so easy at this point to get a bonus card by simply spritzing the stencil with some water to get the ink moving, and then flipping it over onto a panel of watercolor cardstock. I like to use a paper towel to press it down and let the color really transfer into the cardstock, and then when I lift everything up, I have a soft, almost abstract-looking negative image of the stencil. The colors have blended beautifully. To finish these 2 cards, I used some satin gold cardstock from Tonic Studios' Festive Lights paper pack and the Merry Christmas script die from Pretty Pink Posh. I inlaid the die cuts into the panels, and I added a couple of gold jewels from Pretty Pink Posh. I love getting 2 cards for one, and using the leftover ink on a stencil is a great way to do that. For card number 2, I have the new MFT Stamps Pine Tree Forest stencil taped down to Nina White cardstock and a whole bunch of Catherine Pooler mini inks in blues and greens. This time I'm doing some selective stenciling, meaning that I'm only going to blend ink onto one of the types of trees rather than all of them. This will give my card an airier look with more white space. I used the sponge daubers to put the ink through the trees I wanted to use, doing 3 or 4 of each shade of blue or green, and trying to spread them around for a random look. Of course, as I got closer to the end, I realized that I probably only needed to do 2 or 3 of each color, but that's okay. These colors are close enough together that no one will notice if they're not exactly equal. I removed the stencil, and although I loved all the white space, I wanted to add a touch of my own to make my card unique. I quickly cut a negative circle mask from a Post-it note, and then I used gray ink to create a bubble around each tree. I used hardly any ink at all, rubbing most of it onto the Post-it note before blending around the outer edge of the circle. This technique gives a soft and dimensional look, really making the circles look like bubbles. I don't know if it makes any sense, but I quite like the look of it. Some of the bubbles overlapped a bit because the trees were closer together, but I think that just adds to the fun. But then I really wanted to add more fun, so I put the tree stencil back in place and I got out my Nuvo Glimmer Paste in Moonstone. This is a clear, sparkly paste that is going to take my trees to the next level. And again, I was lazy and I didn't want to mask, so I just used the very tip of my tonic media spatula to take out tiny bits of the paste and put it down just on the areas where the ink-blended trees were. This took a bit of time and some care, but it was still so much easier than cutting tiny masks for those trees. For my sentiment, I used an old MFT piece die, and I cut it from white cardstock that had been colored with the same gray ink. I coated each letter with the same glimmer paste for some more sparkle, and I stacked the letters up with 3 more layers before gluing them to the card front. Card number 3 was inspired by the first Christmas card we've received at our house this year. I love plaid, and I think the gold foil adds an elegant touch. To create my plaid, I used the stitch plaid cover plate from a Jillian Vance design, and I did a bit of swatching to try and see which of my Catherine Pooler inks best matched. I've got Queen for a Day, Spruce, and Juniper Mist here, and I think I've got a pretty good match. I used my dome blender to put the ink onto the cover plate die cut, and it went on so smoothly with really good coverage. Then I got another panel of cardstock and I blended the spruce ink over it. This is a big area and it takes quite a bit of ink. I could have done a direct-to-paper technique by swiping the ink pad over the paper, but this worked fine in the end. It looks a bit splotchy now, but as it dried, it smoothed out, and you'll see that in a couple of minutes. I used another sheet of the tonic gold satin cardstock, and I cut the holly and swirls die from it, as well as 3 from white cardstock, and then I did the same for the joy die. I used my Nuvo Deluxe liquid adhesive to stack up the die cuts, and I put an acrylic block over them while the glue dried. I used the largest stitch dot rectangle die to cut the green panel. This die is the exact same size as the stitch plaid cover plate, so now these 2 panels will stack perfectly to mimic the plaid from my inspiration card. And here are the 2 cards together. I think I got the look of the original pretty well with my supplies. I love doing inspiration challenges like this. I think that the satin cardstock really adds a soft elegance that a mirror cardstock wouldn't have. Even though these 2 dies are from different sets, they're both swirly and they work really well together. Card number 4 has no die cuts at all, just lots of stamping. I used this snowflake from the new Catherine Pooler Chillin Snowflakes set. It has both solid and outline components that give it a bit of a 3D look. I chose a rainbow of inks, but for placement I started by lining up my panel on my glass media mat and then stamping the first snowflake off the top, right in the center. The geometry of the snowflake makes it really easy to line up when I use a clear acrylic block, but of course you could use a MISTI if you want to. I worked my way down the row of blues and greens, using a baby wipe to clean between each inking, but also drying the stamp with a cloth. If you don't dry the stamp, it can start to hold on to the moisture from the baby wipe and transfer back onto your panel. When I moved to the outside rows, I placed the image kind of in between the 2 to the right of it to create an offset pattern. I'll speed through the rest of the stamping because you get it. You can see that my stamp is stained, but one of the great things about these inks is that once you've cleaned the stamp, you don't get any ink transfer. I don't even worry that my lightest yellow was my final color. It's perfectly true to the color it's supposed to be. To add even more dimension to the snowflakes, I used a couple of gray Copic markers around the lower left edges. I'll show you what I mean on the red snowflake. I started with the lighter marker, and I put a line of gray under each point that has an edge that would cast a shadow. Next, I went into just a few of the center areas with the darker gray marker. It blends with the lighter one and creates a deeper shadow next to the center of the snowflake. You can skip this step if you're trying to make multiples in a hurry, but I do really like the added dimension it gives. To finish the card, I added a simple joy sentiment from the Holiday Mix set so that none of the snowflakes would be covered. I added some tiny silver star confetti from the Motor City Sequin Mix, and I put the panel onto a black card base. Card number 5 is not a card you're going to make multiples of, but it's dramatic and definitely worth the time it took me. I started with some green and turquoise color burst powders and a piece of watercolor cardstock. I spritzed water over it and I dried it with my heat gun. Then I layered up some more powder until I got the panel with lots of depth. I added a bit of yellow to add some areas of brightness, and when it was dry, I added lots of shimmer to the panel with some Avery Elle shimmer spray. I used the pretty pink Posh winter scene die to cut lots of little Christmas trees from the panel for my card. Next, I started to work on the focal panel of the card by placing a circle mask in the center. There's a sentiment underneath it, but I went another direction in the end, so I won't spend time on that here. I started blending Catherine Pooler inks over the panel to create a night sky. I started with Hot Tub just around the circle, and then I moved into orange peel, which gives such a nice warm glow to the sky. I used Sangria around the edges to deepen it up, and because there was already orange peel underneath, I got kind of a burnt orange blend, which is beautiful. I cleaned up the ink on the Make Art station with a baby wipe so that I wouldn't get it on my project or my fingers, and then I used a distress sprayer to spritz some big drops of water over the panel to create some texture. I lifted the water and some of the ink off with a paper towel, and then removed the mask. There's that greeting, but don't worry about it. Two things happened next. I added some juniper mist along the very edges of the panel to deepen up my night sky, and I put my trees down around the circle to create a kind of forest. At this point, I'm just testing spacing, and they're not glued down. I pushed them off the edge of the panel so I could keep track of them while I glued them down, and I lined up the panel and used a magnet to hold it in place. Then I used liquid glue for some of the trees around the circle, trying to mix color and size somewhat randomly, but still pleasing to the eye, if you know what I mean. For the final few trees, I cut small triangles of foam tape and I popped them up for a bit of dimension. Now back to that greeting. I felt that the sentiment I had originally chosen didn't fill the white circle really well, and I also felt like that white circle was too stark in all this rich color. So I used a sentiment that I kind of patched together from a couple of other sets, Everyday Greetings and Pinata Party, and I embossed it in white on a black circle, just slightly smaller than the masked white one, so there's still a white border. I think the color and texture on this card is stunning, if I do say so myself. And that's it, my 5 ideas for Christmas cards. Now be sure to head over to Ingrid's channel for even more ideas for your holiday cards. And I'll tell you a secret, I've seen them already, and I know you're going to love them. Ingrid is a multimedia goddess, and I learn something new every time I watch one of her videos. If you enjoyed my video, please give it a thumbs up below and subscribe to this channel for more inspiration. Product links are below in the description and also on my blog. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.